I want to say welcome to this first lecture in the spring section of our 2022-23 lecture series. I'm just very excited tonight to be able to host Destin Jenkins. I mean, when I first saw his book on, the bonds of inequality, I was impressed by the topic. But then when I picked up the book and started to read it, I was even more impressed. And I realized that as an urbanist, as an urban historian, he was raising questions that we seldom raise in the context of our studies of African-American labor and urban history. And so he has pioneered a new area. So I'm excited tonight to have the opportunity to introduce him. But let me just say a few words before we get started, before I introduce Destin. As you know, I'm the director of the Center for African American Urban Studies and the Economy, but I'm also the John Eagle University Professor of History and Social Justice. And so there are a lot of people who have played an important role in the work that we do with cause and in the research that I do as a university professor. So I want to just thank those people, some of those people. One of the people I want to call attention to are the John Eagle Foundation and the John Eagle Corporation. They actually support my professorship. So I want to say thanks to them. But in this particular enterprise, we can't get much done if we don't have the support of our university. And so I'm happy to acknowledge that Carnegie Mellon University has been forthcoming. The president, the provost, the dean, and the department head, Nico Slate, at this time in the history department, have been very forthcoming in supporting the work that we do at Cause. So I want to thank them. And the Department of History staff people, Natalie Taylor, our business manager, and Victoria, the Department of History's coordinator, they have helped all along over the years with Cause activities. But this particular event, they have been especially helpful because we are now in the process of finding a new Cause program coordinator. We are interviewing for that position, so they have stepped up to help us arrange speakers, travel arrangement, some catering that hopefully you enjoyed the food tonight. So I want to thank them. And this is a collaborative project, speaker series. We're hosting this with the Hines College, and Dean Krishnan at the Hines College has been very supportive of this effort. But Sri Ansh Mehta, please look at the back of the room. He has been a stellar supporter in getting out the publicity, the flyers, and helping us to arrange these meetings. So thanks very much, Sri. But I want to say that this particular moment in the history of Cause is special. It's special because over the last 2 years, we have been engaged in a project that is called Crafting Democratic Futures. It's a 3-year A.W. Mellon funded project on reparations, and it's called Situating Colleges and Universities in Community-Based Reparation Solutions. And so over the past 2 years, we have assembled a number of people who are helping to facilitate the work on that project. This project is centered at the University of Michigan under the leadership of Earl Lewis, a historian and director of what is called the Center for Social Solutions. And this particular project, Pittsburgh is one of about 10 partners in this project. It is a project that is national in scope. It involves looking at the history and the case for reparations in a diverse number of places. Emory University is part of this project, Spelman College, Rutgers University, Newark, Watford College in Spartanburg, South Carolina, and a number of other places. But also I want to bring to your attention that WQED, public television, is a partner in this project. And so sooner or later, hopefully you will be able to see some of the documentary dimensions of this project as it unfolds. And so I want to say that this is a special lecture and it's a special part of our work because we crafted this particular speaker series around the question of reparation so that it would dovetail with our work on the Democratic Futures project. And we have a number of team members. Sam Black is here. Patricia Mitchell, one of our community fellows, Carla Young, and a few other people are here who are working with us as part of the team. And also our graduate students. We have 3 graduate assistants who have worked with us on this project. And so tonight, I'm especially pleased to call your attention to that particular dimension of our work. But bear with me, there's another piece that I want to share with you. And I'd like for you to be able to join us in some way. In 2023, in October, the Urban History Association will meet in Pittsburgh for its biennial meeting. It will be the first meeting of this organization in 4 years. And we're holding that meeting in Pittsburgh. And the theme of the conference is reparations and the rights to the city. And so we're anticipating bringing a number of scholars from a variety of disciplines, as well as activists, educators, policymakers to Pittsburgh, and to dovetail that work of the conference with the work that we're doing in the Democratic Futures Project and the work that we're doing with CAUSE. And so I want to invite you and encourage you to take a look at the Urban History Association websites and propose a talk or a panel for that meeting. We're welcoming people from a broad range of areas, including activists, local community organizers, as well as academics. So please take a look. That particular website for you to submit a proposal will be up until February 20. But there will be some latitude. If you are committed to putting together a proposal, please get in touch with us. And if it can be done within the deadline, that would be great. But if you need more time, I think we're amenable. We want to generate the best possible program we can generate. And so we want to encourage rather than discourage your participation. So without further ado and delay, let me now turn to the introduction of our speakers. Well, Destin, I just want to say welcome to Pittsburgh. Destin is especially well situated to help us with this reparations question. He is a professor of history, assistant professor at the moment at Stanford University in California. He received his PhD degree from Stanford in 2016. So that's quite an accolade to be able to get invited back to your alma mater to serve on the faculty. Before taking his current position at Stanford, however, he served as assistant professor of history at the University of Chicago. He was also a postdoctoral fellow at the Harvard University Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History, where he served as the Global American Studies postdoctoral fellow. So his interests are broad, covering national and transnational dimensions. In a relatively brief period of time in the field, Dr. Jenkins has compiled an impressive record of research, publications, and professional and community service. In addition to the bonds of inequality, debt, and the making of the American city, published by the University of Chicago Press in 2021. And this, by the way, is the subject of his talk today. He is also the author, co-author of the edited volume of path-breaking essays titled Histories of Racial Capitalism, published by Columbia University Press, also in 2021. In addition, he is a prolific writer of op-ed pieces in such news sources, leading news sources, as the New York Times, the Washington Post, and The Nation. He has also presented his work in a variety of professional forums, including at the annual meetings of the Organization of American Historians, the American Historical Association, and the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. He is an innovative, energetic, and busy historian. And he is destined, that name is really fitting. He is destined to do great things within this field that he has chosen to work. Today, he will deliver a talk based on research for his first book, and that talk is titled The Bonds of Inequality, Debt, and the Urban African American Experience. So let us now welcome Professor Destin Jenkins.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. I want to begin by thanking colleagues with the Cause Hines Lectures Speaker Series. Very grateful for the invitation. And I only begin there because I have way more accolades and things to say and accolades to heap upon you, Dr. Trotter. I mean, you start to get a little emotional because this is someone who has championed my work across a variety of forms, wrote a terrific review of my book, for which I'm grateful. Extended the invitation to me today, and to be recognized by one of the key figures in the field of African American urban history is a true honor. And in addition, just to see you be so gracious to give people shout outs, to acknowledge other people's work and efforts, to integrate so many different moving pieces and parts, a speaker series, a reparations project. He also didn't mention he's the president of the Urban Historical Association. I mean, like the ability to know, this is difficult. How does the left hand know what the right hand's doing? Sometimes in this game, you had a hard time figuring it out. And somehow, not somehow, you're just unique and gifted. You've managed to integrate it all. And so to be, kind of entering this game a few years in, I should say, and to see you and all the work that you've done, it really is an inspiration. So thank you. My gratitude extends to Natalie Taylor and Victoria Donahue for arranging my visit, and Shri for the tech support. I don't know, Shri, give you a shout out again. Thank you so much. And thanks to all of you for attending. So what I want to do first is just give you a sense of who I am and what I research, give you also a sense of the fields in which I situate my research, and then kind of give something of a mature book talk. I don't want to rehash exactly what I say in the book, but give you a sense now 2 years out. Here's what I thought I was doing. Here are the questions I entertained. And here's what I think the book ultimately does. So I'm a historian of capitalism and democracy in post-Reconstruction America. My work is broadly concerned with the causes and consequences of inequality and its relationship to various markets, financial markets, the informal market, labor markets, and so forth, housing markets as well. I also study the moments of and conditions under which African Americans organize collectively to challenge systems of domination. And by the way, can you all hear me? I should okay. Okay, I'll speak up. And how's the sound? We got the microphone. Is that causing any? Okay, all right, great. Okay, my primary contributions are to the history of finance and African-American urban history. So let me say something about each of these fields, and then I'll talk about how they relate to one another. Like so many, I came to the history of finance in the wake of the 2007-2008 financial crisis. I'll say I was an undergrad at Columbia at the time. In the midst also of movements against concentrated financial power and the profiteering from punishment. I wanted to think through the contingency of economic crises and relative stability and decode the workings and meanings of various financial instruments, relationships, and dependencies that undermined future prospects, my family included. In so doing, I participated in what's been described as the financial turn in the history of capitalism. If earlier work emphasized the production and consumption of goods and services, recent accounts stress the importance of stocks, bonds, insurance to the American economy writ large, and in soothing and also exacerbating political and social conflicts. Here is just an advertisement I pulled. It's very interesting to me because this is before the stock market crash in October 1929, engaging in a kind of history, thinking about the importance of the gold rush and using it to sell investors on various financial instruments. Historians of American finance, recent historians, I should say, have shown how those moved by pecuniary and speculative profit, to summarize one historian, are neither proto-capitalists nor parasites on the production of commodities, the exchange of goods, services, or on the wages of workers. Throughout American history, though in historically contingent ways, finance has been core to state formation, freedom dreams, and broader struggles for power. We could think about the ways in which the savings from freedmen, it gets channeled through the financial market, invested in various railroad bonds, and when those bonds go belly up, wiping out the savings, and also the freedom dreams of many Black folks, or at least the immediate realization the dreams persist. And yet, scholars have not adequately given credit to white supremacy, as political scientist Michael Dawson has cleverly remarked. Dawson took to task an entire genre, a genre that missed the fundamental role of white supremacy in particular, and race more generally, in structuring financial practices, markets, and relations. And so this was the analytical problem, so to speak, with which I was engaged. And so over the past decade, I've been concerned with the dynamic relationship. Are we good? Okay. All right. All right. All right. Can people see my screen? Okay. Oh, what about on Zoom? Okay. Yeah. All right. It's like, all right. Thank you, guys. Okay. I think we're good. All right. Okay. So here is the edited volume that Dr. Trotter previously mentioned, Histories of Racial Capitalism with my co-editor, Justin Leroy, historian now at Duke University. That's a collection of interdisciplinary essays of folks who are trying to think about, one, what is racial capitalism? What are its limits? What's its utility as a framework or methodology even? And it brings together folks across various fields to try to think about that historical relationship. And it's plural. Histories, we can't possibly write a definitive collection of the history of racial capitalism. It's meant as a conversation starter, and finance and matters of debt are core across all of the essays. And so myself, I pursued that problem, trying to make sense of that analytical problem by reading the financial press to discover the efforts, for instance, of New South boosters to mobilize investment through racist narratives of Reconstruction, by charting the tactics of civil rights activists to break the bonds of segregation, by uncovering the role of racial ideology in structuring the mid-20th century bond market, and by sketching the links between the fiscal strictures, various fiscal strictures and global and domestic Black emancipatory projects, trying to think about the indemnity imposed on Haiti and its relationship to other kinds of forms of indebtedness and debts imposed on folks who dare dream of freedom. For me, race is not the gloss to the more fundamental deracialized matter of credit or debt, but nor does race work in the same ways across different contexts and sites of struggle. So this kind of relationship, basically to attention to historical contingency, necessitates a robust analytical toolkit to parse and weigh the centrality of, say, racial narratives, racist violence, distasteful joke lore, as the bankers of the mid-20th century would describe it, and white power in mobilizing investment, not to equate them and to figure out what is actually driving what when it comes to mobilizing investment. The history of finance, though, is not just about capital accumulation. Within the field, I also focus on municipal finance, the largely technocratic arena of revenues, expenditures, debt, and administration. And so here are some documents that were key to the book that I wrote, trying to identify the finance officer, the accountants, comptrollers, largely appointed figures who play an outsized role in managing the purse and therefore managing distributionary struggles. And so to think about municipal finance as an arena of struggle, as a site to historicize, you also historicize categories of revenues, for instance, the change over time between a reliance, say, on property taxes and revenue from fines and fees. To see municipal finance as an arena composed of people, real people who met quietly to structure the balance, so to speak, between economic growth, political stability, and racial hierarchy, expands the boundaries, are key actors who we usually focus in on in shaping urban practices and policies. And so it's this attention to finance that I think brings a fresh perspective to the field of African-American urban history. So let me say a little bit about what I've seen. The field of 20th century African-American urban history proceeds from a demographic transformation. And I'm talking about the 6 million African-Americans who left the South between 1910 and 1970, otherwise known as the Great Migration. For 6 decades, Black folks fled Virginia, the Carolinas, Texas, Louisiana, among the other southern states, for New York City, Detroit, Chicago, Milwaukee, and elsewhere. And my own family on my dad's side, I guess my great grandfather, they left South Carolina well before the formal start. We are 4th-generation New Yorkers. And so, this is also a personal story, as it is for so many Black folks who have ties to the South. And my wife, her family never left. They stayed in Mississippi. And so we can think about the different routes and routes of folks who stayed, who left, and then the kind of the great meeting of my wife and I when giving birth to our daughter in California. So anyway, it's all the personal stuff. But analytically, let's get back to that. This migration, writes Isabel Wilkerson, transformed, quote, urban America and recast the social and political order of every city it touched. As historians, we can another image from Jacob Lawrence's The Bus. As historians trace the movements, settlements, and Black community formations outside the South, there remain, though, in the literature, some unstated presumptions about what capitalism was and its relationship to the urban form. They worked largely within a Fordist, post-Fordist, industrial, post-industrial schematic. To talk about capitalism was to consider Black folks as industrial workers, as your own Joe Trotter did in his pioneering study, Black Milwaukee. To talk about the declining economic prospects of African Americans was to detail the causes and racial effects of deindustrialization in a place like Detroit, Oakland, or elsewhere. So within the literature, cities and the kind of dominant schematic at work was a kind of industrial, post-industrial framework. And I'll show and say a bit more about what we missed in assuming and working within that framework. Within the literature, cities were also battlegrounds over consumption. So we're thinking about the production-consumption dialectic there. Cities were places in which Black folks dealt with the vexing question of selling the race in a century in which their ancestors were bought and sold, as Adam Green, the historian at UChicago, so astutely observed. In some accounts, the African-American urban experience with capitalism was thus read through production, from the adaptation of agricultural workers to industrial life, to the social reproduction of Black women captured at the Bronx slave market, so brilliantly described by Ella Baker and Marvell Jackson Cook. So we're thinking about production and consumption as the kind of core points of emphasis in the field of African-American urban history. But by contrast, my work attends to the financial relationships through which much of Black urban life was rendered. And so in some sense, Dr. Trotter gave me his Workers on Arrival book, and at the very end is a historiographical essay, notes on sources, where you talk about politics, movements, gender, and also the global as kind of, the key kind of the new areas of study in African-American urban history. And so my work builds on that by focusing in on finance. So when Black parents in East Baltimore protested that, quote, colored schools of the city had not received money from a $1 million bond issued in 1912, they were implicitly commenting on the bond market, the separate but equal logic by which borrowed funds were guided, and the failure of city officials to abide by the terms of racial governance. I'm also intrigued by those moments when Black resistance registered as events in the Bill Sewellian sense of touching off, quote, a chain of occurrences that durably transforms previous structures and practices, and in the ways typically discussed in finance, right? An event as the sudden intangible negative change in a borrower's capacity to meet its payment obligations. On the one hand, in African-American urban history, the Great Migration emerges as the central event, but in the financial press, it's rarely discussed as such. So how do we make sense of that discrepancy between what counts as an event in our fields versus in the world of finance? And I'm also committed to uncovering the fiscal inquest core to the Black freedom struggle, how expressions of resistance could at once produce new community investments and harden spatial inequities. And so attending to the paradoxes of resistance, and this I think is also new in the field of African-American history, is not just power versus resistance, but the ways in which resistance can deepen power relations that give rise to still other moments of struggle. And so by attending to the paradoxes of resistance, I hope we can, I hope to train our eyes on some of the dilemmas of the 21st century, reparation being one of them. These themes operate at the heart of my book, The Bonds of Inequality, Debt and the Making of the American City. Through a focus on San Francisco, it treats the municipal bond market and the changing politics of municipal debt as central to the creation and maintenance of post-war urban inequality. So let me say a bit more about the bond market and what a bond is. The municipal bond market, in my account, is a politically constructed network that links states and local government borrowers, financiers, investors, sellers of financial information, among others. In and through that market, borrowers issue bonds. Bonds are basically loans used by local governments to distribute the huge cost of capital improvement projects over an extended period of time. No treasure chest from which to draw $50 million and pay for improvement projects. You spread the payments over time. You promise tax-exempt interest income to the investors. We most often encounter a bond when we're asked to say yes or no to a school issue or a road issue. But there's a whole world that lurks beneath that. The municipal bond market was and remains, this is today, a $4 trillion market, was and remains the essential means by which cities, suburbs, and other political subdivisions of states cover the cost of large-scale improvement projects. So the book makes two major arguments. The first proceeds from the simple but rarely asked question, how did municipal governments become dependent on the bond market for immense and racially differentiated investments in infrastructure? To see that as a historical relationship that's not timeless, that's not inevitable, and to ask how it came to be. Of course, finance has long been a structuring influence in urban development. But as the Great Depression revealed the failures of credit rating agencies, as it convulsed cities and bondholders alike, the New Deal doubled down on the municipal bond market. To take one example, the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933, which separated commercial from investment banking, continued to allow commercial and investment banks to underwrite and invest in certain types of municipal bonds. As a result, public infrastructure and social services would continue to be financed along a public-private axis. This is well before neoliberalism supposedly inaugurated the public-private partnership. Billions of dollars were financed through the market circuitry. The political consequences were less apparent than dollars and cents, but no less significant. The New Deal reconstruction of the bond market recoupled waste management systems and school construction, for instance, to the lending criteria of an unelected fraternity of financiers, bond attorneys, and rating analysts. That's the first argument concerning dependence. The second argument is that racial inequalities in San Francisco and elsewhere were critically tied to these financial arrangements. The racial politics of the mid-20th century bond market amounted to what I describe as an infrastructural investment in whiteness. It also precipitated a series of revolts that marked the end of the Keynesian consensus of the New Deal. So let me offer you a few episodes to give you a sense of the place, the historical actors, and the central drama of the book. Okay. So really quickly, this is a chart kind of showing the comparative cost to borrow. This is a chart that actually privileges the advantage of the investor and yield and interest. Yield is what investors are looking for, and interest is really what local borrowers are going to prioritize. But you can see just after 1945, 1946, the cost to borrow was 1%. That's going to represent a historic borrowing opportunity and trigger a bunch of consequences, which I'll say more of that. So the end of World War II brought about a different sort of peace, a moment of relative peacetime between municipal debtors and creditors. Some still attack tax exemption, echoing FDR's insistence that, quote, a fair and effective progressive income tax and a huge perpetual reserve of tax-exempt bonds cannot exist side by side, seeing a tension between tax-exempt interest income and the privilege to shield one's income from taxation as an affront, as undermining progressive income taxation, which was core following the 16th Amendment. Nevertheless, bond repudiations, the dissolution of municipal charters, the attacks on the creditor class, these are the kind of arguments you see in the late 19th century, and they were largely would remain creatures of the late 19th century. The 1930s discourse of belt-tightening, court-supervised debt restructurings and bond defaults were eclipsed by post-war optimism. In the 1930s, you really had this conflict. It's presented as such between debtors and creditors, but after World War II is a sense of harmony, a sense that there's actually symbiotic interest between lenders and borrowers. Peace rested on federal tax and monetary decisions. In 1941, the federal government began taxing earnings on its own bonds. This gave states and their political subdivisions a near monopoly on tax-exempt investments. And after the war, local governments borrowed at low interest rates. And in the era of high federal marginal tax rates, many wealthy individual investors accepted those lower yielding tax-exempt municipal bonds. So as I describe it in the book, you can think about municipal bonds as kind of the mid-20th century version of today's offshore tax havens, a legitimate way of shielding one's capital from high federal marginal tax rates. Of course, the tax rates don't even compare to what they were, say, in 1951, 91%. But nevertheless, a legitimate way of shielding income from taxation, and local governments take advantage of that and borrow cheaply. City technocrats, the controllers, accountants, and others in charge of managing the purse, not only leveraged a progressive era culture that equated debt with progress. This is another big change in the early 20th century, the sense that all great cities need to borrow in order to solve the ills of urbanization and industrialization. So there's a culture that emerges that equates debt with progress, and that's very different from some of the arguments made in the late 19th century, which is debt is a means of rascality. Debt, and of course, that taps into the kind of Protestant notions around thrift and savings. Through trade associations, these city technocrats gained advice from credit rating professionals, bankers, and attorneys. So those publications of the finance officers, when you look at the conferences, you have key figures from financial institutions and credit rating agencies who are explaining how the bond market works. So what does it mean to actually depend on those folks for advice? What comes along with the advice is a question that the book takes up. They learned how to enhance the marketability of municipal bonds and stymie popular input. This is also key, the sense that you not only needed to purge the kind of boss rule politics of the late 19th century of Boss Tweed and to purge city finance of corruption, but you also needed to place enough parameters around municipal finance such that everyday folks had very little to say beyond yes or no on a bond issue, and increasingly even that question was taken off the table. Through this exchange, the bond fraternity gained a seat at the influential table of urban financial strategizing. So here's the way in which someone like Alan Brown, who's a key banker with Bank of America for the book, and also seen as Mr. Municipal Bond, the key guy during the 20th century, is not only underwriting for Bank of America, he also is appointed to key committees in San Francisco to shape the kinds of bonds that the public would even see in the first place. San Francisco's Harry D. Ross, he's the controller, managed city expenditures, the city's borrowing reputation, and a broader distributionary struggle, which was also exacerbated by migrations. War production triggered, quote, a mass in-migration without duplicate since the days of gold, explained one landlord in San Francisco. Between 1940 and 1950, the city's population increased from 635,000 to 775,000. The arrival of Black Americans shuffled the city's racial axis, right? Not just no longer defined along a white Asian racial axis, but Black folks as shocking that racial hierarchy. In 1940, for instance, the city's Black population was less than 5,000 people. By 1960, Black folks numbered close to 75,000 people. So what was the second great migration for Chicago and Detroit was San Francisco's first. And then the question is, what happens when Black folks arrive much later than in other cities when it comes to managing revenues, expenditures, and maintaining political stability? So for Ross, the controller, the questions were, how do you accommodate calls for new housing in place of slums, parks in lieu of playgrounds beneath highways, public schools to replace cracker box structures, and which communities would be deemed worthy of debt? And so we're thinking also, it's a kind of longer framework here. Those are the post-World War II questions. But in many ways, San Francisco, like many other cities, had been reliant on an infrastructure developed during the early 20th century. So you're talking about an infrastructure that's much older. During the 1930s, the kind of budget cuts, bond rejections, the failure of various bond issues means that cities following World War II are relying on a much older infrastructure, especially one that's taxed by the war effort, right? Think about playgrounds repurposed and appropriated for war production and activities. That's going to deteriorate the roads and so forth. So it's a really important set of questions that Ross has to take up. Muni finance officers also had to manage these demands conducive to economic growth and political stability. The opposite, urban decline and political instability, might dampen buyer interest in city bonds and drive up the cost to borrow, perhaps leading to a deleterious cycle with no end. Economic growth was not an objective, deracialized pursuit, nor were the spoils of economic growth evenly distributed. Debt financing provided jobs for white construction workers and segregated building trades. Schools, airports, and parking facilities for middle-class white households in San Francisco and the wider Bay Area, tax-exempt interest income for wealthy white individual bondholders, underwriting profits for bankers, and subscription fees for rating agencies. So this is what I mentioned, the point about the infrastructural investment in whiteness as a cross-class compact. White folks are going to benefit from building the little infrastructure. White middle-class folks are going to use those trains and baseball stadiums even to consume. And all the while it's going to kick up rents upward to wealthy bondholders who, for reasons of the history of the racial wealth gap, are largely white, it's safe to assume. The benefits of debt were expressed in class-specific ways, but it amounted to a white cross-class compact. So at one level, this post-war debt arrangement was preserved by low interest rates, commercial banker appetite for municipal bonds, and a growth spurt that delivered timely interest and principal payments. But at another level, it rested on displacing Black folks through urban renewal, reclaiming land for white-collar professionals, and the infrastructural neglect of Black and brown residents. And so it's the intersection of both matters of macroeconomic policy, I suppose, and also the what I call described as the timeless mechanism of Black expendability, of displacing Black folks from the land in central San Francisco, repurposing it, as we see here, a vision of the new city in San Francisco, replacing Black neighborhoods, communities, a thriving commercial enclave that develops after Black folks arrive, and repurposing the land so that you can stimulate economic growth in ways that kick back enough income and revenues to pay back bondholders. That's really that piece, right, between the macro and the social history of displacement. So the key moment in the book is 1966. The credit crunch of 1966 spelled several ends. An end to the low interest rate regime, peacetime between creditors and debtors, and between end to the post-war debt compact between city technocrats and the populations over which they govern. Inflation repelled bondholders. As Dun & Bradstreet's Wade Smith explained, so long, quote, as investors anticipate continued inflation, they would demand higher interest yield to hedge against being paid in cheaper dollars in the future. Across the nation, large government borrowers pared down the size of their offerings. Other municipal governments canceled bond sales. Still others failed to receive bids altogether. City finance directors placed police force reductions, for instance, hospital closures, and overcrowded schools at the doorsteps of raiders and bond financiers. So this relationship, which gets rekindled in the 1930s, which is seen as being symbiotic, ultimately snaps back on local government borrowers who now have to postpone, cancel various projects at the same moment when Black folks are making increased demands on the state for infrastructural provisions. And so that is, to me, one of the missing pieces in the history of African-American urban history, is to think about not just and I'll just use a personal example here. My parents, who were born in New York, sent me to a private school because they knew the quality of the local public schools. And so the stories of the quality of the infrastructural quality of parks and playgrounds and roads and streets is well known, but why we see the sort of differential investments across cities, why it is that Black folks during the key moment in the freedom struggle were saying our schools are overcrowded, We now have the political power to do so, but ultimately they make demands on local officials, but can't reach the world of finance, who are ultimately imposing their own kinds of strictures to undermine democratic investment. So that's the key piece. And 66 is not just important for the macroeconomic story of the end of a low interest rate regime, but also the shift from the classic phase of the civil rights movement to Black power. So what does matters of interest rate have to say or do for our understanding of that shift from the classic phase to Black power? In San Francisco, we could think about the city's debt arrangement as collapsing under the demands of the modern Black freedom struggle. And the city's Black bond politics, as I've called it, was expressed in two ways. The first was through the boycott, no surprise there. In 1966, the city's leading African-American newspaper, The Sun Reporter, used bond referenda to exact concessions from local government. Since the end of World War II, the Sun Reporter editorialized, quote, "The Negro voters of San Francisco have given above a 90% yes vote in support of all local bond issues. But unless the city appointed a Black person to various public commissions, the public utility commissions, for instance, the paper encouraged Black folks to reject the city's spending priorities." When a pair of bond measures failed, Sun Reporter owner Dr. Carlton Goodlett, we see him here, noted, quote, "We think we kept the Negro vote from going higher." He hoped this expression of Black bond politics would prove, quote, "a national trend wherever we face an unfriendly administration." Of course, we think about the boycott in terms of boycotting various sites of production, factories, for instance, or sites of consumption, a shopping mall, a downtown facility. Here was an expression of Black bond politics, where Goodlett and folks are saying the bond referendum is an important target. And we can use the increased power of Black voting power to demand that the city actually respond, in this case, in ways that are kind of akin to patronage, right? Or at least in the sense of sort of trying to appoint key Black folks to public utility commissions in the sense that that would lead to wider community investments. That's an assumption that, that is its own thing. But thinking about the power of the boycott to try to exact concessions from local government with a specific focus on bond issues is an important missing piece of the larger history of the boycott and its centrality to the Black freedom struggle. Rebellion was the second form of Black bond politics. After the police killing of 16-year-old Matthew Johnson in September 1966, Black folks took to the streets. The protest sparked fears that San Francisco, that quote famed liberal city, could join Detroit and Newark as urban battlefields, explained one bond spokesperson who got behind this particular issue. Here's a photo of Yolanda Westry, who was Black children used as a way of drumming up sympathy to get voters to approve an issue, in this case for park and recreation bonds in the predominantly Black neighborhood of Southeast, Bayview, Hunters Point. So in this sense, right, the fear of an uprising, of rebellion and what it would do, not just in terms of political stability, but also potentially driving up the cost to borrow, was what compelled city officials to put specific bond measures for Hunters Point, which was a long neglected neighborhood. In fact, there's around this time, there's a series of issues, and the statement is 17 years. Since 1951, Black folks in this neighborhood have gone without proper infrastructural investments. And they've also paid taxes, by the way, because debts get serviced not just through property taxes passed down through rents, but also through sales taxes, which is generating the revenue to then pay back bondholders, so getting very little in return, if anything. And so rebellion, though, was a more indirect but no less consequential way of compelling infrastructure and economic opportunities from the city. So boycotts, and here's what I also say about trying to make sense of both expressions of Black bond politics. Boycotts, rebellions, and riots, in short, the tactics core to the Black freedom struggle during the 1960s, at least, became credit events. This goes back to my earlier point, right? The discrepancy between what is an event in African-American urban history and whether it registers as such in the financial press. These efforts did amount to credit events. As urban residents revolted, creditors began to question the long-term viability of cities themselves, particularly those that supposedly succumbed, quote, to minorities and organized labor, as a Moody spokesperson put it. So it was the structural dependence of local governments on the bond market that gave these racial and class-inflected narratives greater force. That dependence, local government dependence on the bond market, allowed bankers and rating analysts to fold critical acts of resistance into their calculations about investing in cities. Of course, bankers didn't jettison urban America. Indeed, they marketed short-term debt as a way for investors to have their cake and eat it too, as a way of collecting tax-exempt interest income without tying up their capital through long-term investments in rioting cities. Again, 1966, the moment of the credit crunch we see here, Bank of America, is today the day for short-term profit. And so what you see is a number of financial firms who are anticipating another long, hot summer as early as late April, early May. They say that instead of buying a 20, 30-year bond, purchase short-term notes that's going to kick back short-term tax-exempt interest income and allow you to redeem your principal in 6 months, 9 months, maybe a year. So there's a way in which you could shield your capital from those high federal marginal tax rates, the municipal bonds, without actually tying up your capital in ways that might become risky should there be a riot. In effect, speculating in riots. This is riot futures, a kind of market created, even if not formally, in the possibility of a riot. And so the creditors' revolt presaged future fiscal distress and further harm those savvy enough to be critical of municipal debt in the first place. Was really fascinating in 66. You see the marketability of short-term debts, but by 1974-75, New York City's bankruptcy, short-term debt is seen as an example of the reckless spending and fiscal decision-making of New York City. So in 10 years before, it was an engine of accumulation. It was used, short-term debt being used to market to investors, but 10 years later, it is a sign of the recklessness of city spending officials. Nevertheless, right, so I guess what I'm saying goes back to my point about the paradoxes of resistance, how expressions of resistance can be folded into existing power relations that impose still other strictures on those, again, savvy enough to criticize debt and the relationship between city dependence and the bond market in the first place. But nevertheless, the efforts of those who plumbed the depths of municipal finance, who pursued legal action, who evaluated trade-offs, who employed different modes of protest, should give us hope. At least I get some hope from it. So we might take inspiration from a forgotten episode from the civil rights movement. During the early 1960s, the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, and the NAACP insisted segregation was a national problem, but not just for the reasons with which we've become familiar, not just because violence was national, not just because of the spread of so-called separate but equal laws, not just because school and housing segregation. No, segregation was a national problem, they reasoned, because it was financed by bankers who specialize in the business of debt, co-signed through the approval of bond attorneys in New York City, Chicago, and elsewhere. And because investors from around the country collected interest payments from indebted Southern segregated municipalities. Unwittingly, CORE neatly summarized, quote, the municipal bond industry over the years became one of the economic cornerstones on which segregation now rests. And here you see this flyer from the Philly CORE office. John Levine, a major investment bank that financed infrastructure through the bond market in general, but also the claim that it was engaged in illegal practices. This is going to be core to their kind of legal strategy as well. But trying to target financial institutions. And what I do elsewhere is think about, you see that last bullet point, it says, urge John Levine to stop financing segregated schools, their address is. So trying to launch protests outside of these financial institutions but one of the things I've shown in some other work is targeting the financial institution through a picket, for instance, came too late. They had already underwritten the bond issue. And so what you're thinking about is the different temporalities of protests. You have to, when it comes to matters of finance, you can't just picket outside as you would a Woolworths. You have to find other moments to disrupt the bond sale itself, or at least create enough uncertainty so that secondary investors say, actually, we'd rather just invest elsewhere. These connections became the target of an important yet understudied campaign to advance desegregation. With Brown as the wellspring, Brown v. Board, by March 1963, National Core leadership believed that turning off the valve of Northern financing would prove, quote, the greatest single blow to Southern school segregation since the 1954 Supreme Court decision. So after the courts have acted, just before the voting and the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts, at this moment, there's a sense that there's an impasse here. We've used the courts, we've used direct action sit-ins, but yet Southern municipalities are still able to segregate. So the sense of new tactic, we have to figure out how to target the financial institutions that are ultimately underwriting segregation. The mere threat of lost funding, they reason, could be used to pressure Southern schools to desegregate. Prompted by the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the NAACP coordinated an inimitable, that's a tough one, boycott of the banks that underwrote segregation in Mississippi. Taken together, these civil rights strategists relied on epochal shifts in federal law to disrupt the national investment in segregation. And they combined social movement tactics and legal strategies to pierce the otherwise hidden world of bond finance. So while we've dismissed, and historians have done this, not everybody, may sound surprising, the classic phase of the civil rights movement was largely a liberal project. In characterizing that classic phase in the efforts of NAACP and CORE as a liberal project that missed the mark, actually we missed how they were ahead of the curve in understanding the problem of finance, of understanding the temporalities of finance. And so it's important in any phase when we think about the Black freedom struggle, what was the fiscal aptitude and sensibilities, and how can we use those in the present? As civil rights strategists and those engaged in Black bond politics discovered, the municipal bond market and the politics of municipal debt was complicated. The relations obscure and the terms and advantages difficult to pin down. But through a methodology, one grounded in a racially literate materialist approach to capital and debt, revenues and expenditures, it pierced the veil. And we may likewise break the bonds of inequality and obviate the profitability of what emerges in its wake by engaging in a similar methodology that's attentive to the granular, the boring, the dry, the humdrum municipal finance documents. And so with that, I'll end with you guys and thank you for your attention. I really appreciate it and look forward to your questions.
Very good. Thank you very much for that. And we'll let you handle the question.
Okay, that sounds good. Do people, I don't think we need a mic.
Victoria may be able to help with some of the online.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think we'll be able to hear everybody, but just in case you want to do that. I'll leave it off. And if you could just say your name, that would be great. Please.
My name is Samuel Black. Thank you for your talk. Extremely informative. And Joe mentioned before, it brings up a lot of questions and maybe those of us who work with those in this field and that have not thought either, you know, into this. But I have so many questions. I'm just going to pick one.
Go.
And maybe after others, I'll come back.
Awesome.
What is the Sunday gift card? And shortly after World War II, during World War II, the Pittsburgh Courier that initiated in 1942 actually doubled the campaign.
Right.
But most people don't realize that after the war, they also initiated the double the campaign. 20 or so, 25 years later, one of the major civil rights events in this city were around the construction corporation.
Mm.
The lack of, and this is sort of a labor thing, the lack of African-American workers on capital projects in Pittsburgh that included Three River Stadium, correctly Joe about getting big on Three River Stadium, National City Bank building, US Steel, and so forth.
Mm.
Major construction project in downtown Pittsburgh. Almost without Black folk included, at least in the labor aspect.
Mm-hmm.
But this kind of makes me, your talk is maybe start to think deeper into these types of events in terms of the investment. And just suppose here we are 50 years later and still dealing with almost the same issue in terms of Black workforce, but also disappearance of Black communities as urban renewal, gentrification began to change the landscape. I don't know where my question is in all of this, but your talk is made me kind of refocus and rethink about this. And I can see, as you use the term quite a lot, elsewhere. I can see the elsewhere in a number of urban areas. This sort of lack of control over the financial market to the degree where it's not working for African.
I mean, I appreciate that was the point about the equality and economic development, double E. Thank you for that, because that's some future work I'm interested in. Is like the question taken up by formerly trained Black political economists, but also others who are engaged in Black political economy, more in a vernacular tradition, who are trying to think about what does economic development look like, how to achieve it. And so seeing the Pittsburgh Curry as an important site, not just in articulating the demand for it, but inviting surely other perspectives through columns and op-eds to weigh in what does it look like and how to achieve it. So thank you for that. I mean, I think what I'll say is Pittsburgh is interesting example, because the usual way, and Dr. Trout, you could correct me if I'm wrong, which we understand so much of African-American urban life and cities in general is through the framework of deindustrialization. It's the dominant meta-narrative we use to make sense of the plight of urban workers, the plight of cities themselves. And so Pittsburgh would fit within that framework. It's emblematic, we go from Carnegie to, then the disappearance of work for Black folks. Detroit, of course, is a classic example as well. But even within these cities that go through that transformation, finance is core. And so one question is, when we attend to the financial relationships and partnerships, what does it do for our understanding of the trajectory of such cities like Pittsburgh, which we thought we knew because we worked within a deindustrialization framework? It's not to say that deindustrialization doesn't matter, but it is to say that we need not rely on that meta-narrative to make sense of the conditions that we see play out well before 1945 or 55 or whenever the factories closed their doors. So that's one thing I would say. And to me, San Francisco was like the perfect surprising case, because it had had become far more reliant on finance in the early 20th century. Outpost for the Fed. It's seen as the Wall Street of the West, at least it presents itself as such. But nevertheless, they have to perform before the very same actors whose city, Pittsburgh and Detroit, mayors and comptrollers have to perform, right? They have to go to New York City as well to explain why they are, in fact, creditworthy and should receive a bond upgrade. And so in some sense, the industrial base, it's not to say it doesn't matter. It is to say that deindustrialization, the problem of it, gets layered atop the fundamental problem of the dependence on the bond market. And so in some sense, to think about finance maybe changes some of the trajectories of the city of Pittsburgh, or at least how we understand, even if the outcome upshot looks very similar. I had some other things I want to say, but maybe I'll wait for your next questions and comments. Thank you, Sam. Please, in the back.
Thank you for your remark. My name is Phil Logan. The term racial capitalism is used a lot. But that means that there is a non-racial capitalism that is not supported. Because my cause is I'm very far on the way. I believe in socialism. But on this capitalism, is there a non-racial capitalism that is not exploited? So it's capitalism by its nature that exploited this. And if it is, then what is the significance of the non-racial capitalism?
Oh, these are great questions. Let me say what the significance is for me in my work. I see racial capitalism as a methodology, as a way of seeing. So part of what you need to do when you get engaged, when I've engaged with the financial press, there's a way in which bonds, stocks, par value, interest rates gets laundered of its racial expressions, of its connections to racialized bodies. There's a process of abstraction that occurs that launders a financial investment of the specific racialized terms in which people live and through which the funds will be extended. And so racial capitalism as a methodology, as a way of seeing, helps me approach that otherwise deracialized genre of finance to think about actually, when we're talking about a bond issue, we are talking about a bond market that's also structured along separate but equal logics. So that may not be discussed in the financial press. But when we think about Jim Crow as a national institution going into the early 20th century, we have to think about the separate but equal logic, and racial capitalism as a methodology, as a way of seeing, helps me check the assumptions of the financial press that would assume that it has nothing to do with race. So that to me is the upshot, personally, methodologically. So racial capitalism in general is, of course, a contested term. We put it histories of racial capitalism because the question is, what is its utility outside of the US or outside of the Atlantic framework? I think it helps us make sense of a place like Brazil, a place like Cuba, in terms of, but does it help us make sense of the expansion of capitalism in late 19th century India? I mean, maybe it doesn't. There's an essay in the volume that tries to think about debt, the kinds of debt peonage we see in a place like India in racialized terms through which it was executed. But it is open for debate as in terms of its utility beyond the US Atlantic context. And I think that debate should be had. And it's also important as a check to the notions that race is some superstructure or is external to some more fundamental relationship. And instead, the more interesting question is your other question, which is, if capitalism already relies on other forms of domination and inequalities, why privilege the racial over, say, patriarchy, which arguably predates the racial and even the class dynamics of capitalism? And so in that sense, the more interesting question is not, race versus class, but how do we account for the various differences that are leveraged within a system to extend capital, to seize capital, and to ultimately float the system as a whole. And so that is, thinking about various forms of difference, that it's not the homogenization, but in fact, the heterogeneity of social relations that becomes core to capital's reproduction. And so methodology, that's why I use it, why it's core to me in approaching finance, but also hopefully gives you a sense of some of the other debates that I think are worth having. And yeah, thank you. Yes, please.
I'm trying to relate your talk to my thoughts about Pittsburgh when we were talking about racial capitalism and all of that, and looking at the whole idea of the double duty victory campaign, for instance, and soldiers going off to war, say for Pittsburgh, and returning home expecting to be able to take advantage of some of the benefits that were afforded, allegedly to everybody. But, obviously African Americans and other people of color were kind of left out of the picture. So they couldn't pursue the American dream, quote unquote, and go into areas of the city and be able to purchase homes and live there and that kind of thing because of redlining.
Right.
And then later displacement when the city of Pittsburgh and Mayor Lawrence decided that they wanted to go into the Hill District and they wanted to, just all of a sudden take over certain sections of the hill, right, to beautify it. But that of course wasn't intended for the masses, for everyone. So there was so much with regard to displacement and with people having nowhere to go. And then I think of today and gentrification and companies like Whole Foods coming in and displacing a whole neighborhood in terms of housing and not making plans for people to have, effective housing and places to go. So you've got all of these people that are on the fringes of the city, located in areas where they can't get to work, but because they're way far out. And, it's just, I don't know. I also thought about these two gentlemen, Joe Morris and Bernard Garrett, in LA, and the way that they tried to outsmart the system, by becoming bankers and trying to make sure that, racist banking and real estate practices were kind of done away with. And I admired their ventures. Unfortunately, it didn't work out completely to their advantage, but, they took a stand.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate those comments. I think, let me say something about redlining quickly, because one of there's an assumption that like with redlining was such a repellent of institutional capital that once areas were redlined, mortgage capital didn't enter the picture, and you had contract buying and other kinds of housing transactions. But one of the interesting things when you shift attention from the mortgage to the bond, you actually see that many of the post-World War II public housing projects were financed by bonds in redlined areas. So you see the monetization of redlined and no-lined areas, which is very different from the story of we can't get mortgage capital. This is an area that's a deficit for capital investment. But when you think about the location of public housing projects in redline, no-line areas, that's kicking back rents to bondholders and then having all kinds of other consequences. So that's my read on the redlining literature is this assumption that it's just a total repellent, but actually it's redlined areas, redlining and its relationship to finance, we're going to see a different kind of monetization at work. And it only comes into view when we shift focus away from the mortgage to a bond issue. Joe Morris, Bernard, Garrett, bankers, and the sense that the problem was, and I don't know the story, so you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think it goes to Mr. Logan's question in the back. What we see is post-civil rights era is the sense that the kind of flourishing of Black capitalism, the idea that the problem is not racial capitalism per se with the system, but wealth has been hoarded by white folks. And if only we as Black people could get more access to capital, we can enact some kind of community development, economic development. But what we see, in fact, is extreme polarization of Black folks who are admitted into the corporate boardrooms and who basically steer financial institutions to extract still further wealth from Black communities. So we could think about the kind of city contractor relationship where, for instance, and here's an example, we could think about, this is some of my new work, take the boring, I guess, matter of parking collections. So after 1975, cities increasingly rely on private firms to collect revenues from parking tickets. One of the key firms trying to bid on these city contracts is a firm called Teams Traffic Enforcement Adjudication anyway. And what you see with Teams is you have someone like Cecil Partee from Chicago, elected city treasurer, writing to Mayor Tom Bradley in Los Angeles, trying to get the contract to collect regressive revenues from Black and brown motorists. So there is someone who is using the opportunities as a contractor and that through us as a subcontractor, using his particular position as an elected official, writing on municipal letterhead to try to get a city contract that's going to impose further harm, stresses, and the like on motorists, Black and brown folks. So what does that mean? What does it mean to write to one's brethren, if part of the same fraternity as well, and to secure a contract that's going to, again, lead to further regressive extraction from Black folks? And I think that that's an example of the post-civil rights story of Black absorption into corporate opportunities that then, in the end, impose further harms on working class folks, while also insisting that their ability to enter the corporate boardroom is some grand achievement and success for the race when it's expressed in class terms and also gender terms as well. So again, I don't know the Morris Garrett, but that's at least useful to think about Mr. Logan's question about the racial capitalism piece and making sense of class differentiation post 1975 or so, and accumulation therefrom. Sure, please.
My name is Destin Jenkins.
Hi.
And I really wanted to be here to hear you. My question is different because I'm interested in the answer to everything regarding how Black folks, Black Americans and white Americans, everybody can get a piece of the dream, a piece of the dollar. As you've done your research, what is it that came up for you to say, you know, if Black folks would have done this, we might be better off, more broadly based, because everything we do takes care of a little piece. It takes care of a little piece. But reparations is a nice word. It's going to try to do all of this. But just like Pat's example about folks moving, I'm thinking about all of the people in East Liberty that they moved from public housing to live where? They're out in the suburbs with no public transportation, can't get to the little jobs that they had. And so let me finish and try to make it a question. With your research, experience, understanding of yesterday and today, were there any points in time in history or even now that you said, if Black folks would have done this, we might have been further along on that?
Yeah. Whew, this is a grand question. You said you want to answer everything. That got me kind of like, already a little nervous. Let me, and then you also said something about like something that I found inspiring, a particular effort of Black folks that I found like, it was a small piece, it wasn't the grand. So let me start there. I mentioned the use of Yolanda Westry as part of the bond ephemera to sell folks on the city on some bond issues for Hunter's Point. What I found really interesting was to think about Black parents who, in that context of the uprisings, who are critiquing discrimination, school segregation, but also trying to get a bond issue passed so that their kids don't go to dilapidated schools. I mean, that was in some sense a critique of segregation in the city, of this famed liberal city, which was already an affront to the colorblind liberalism that really was the kind of ideological glue, if you will, of the city's political structure, to critique segregation, but also say, we need to get this bond measure passed because our kids are going to overcrowded schools. That was an important point, right? Because there was the awareness of We need to act collectively for the here and now. Now, for me, though, as a historian, one of the things I take up is that bond issue. If by the way, the story is those bond issues were rejected repeatedly. Not all bond issues, but they were rejected. And the argument at the time is we tried to do something for that somebody, and that somebody is Black, and the city rejected. And so even if it were passed, this is the kind of catch-22. You pass a bond issue, you unlock infrastructural investments, but if you borrow at a high cost, that inflames other kinds of political instabilities, other kinds of tax revolts. And so that to me is how I view history. I guess this is really saying something about my philosophy of history, is not so much the once and for all grand gesture, or even to necessarily judge what they could have done, but to say, this is what they did. This is what it meant. This was the context in which the proposal and struggle occurred. And here were some of the unintended consequences, because no one individual or group sits outside of the complex social relations that define the modern world. And so I'm always trying to think about both the action and also its broader reaction, or the dialectic between the two. So that was important. I also found around this was a kind of devilish dilemma, as I describe it in the book, of making Black property holders, asking Black property owners in Southeast San Francisco to vote for a bond issue to support schools and parks for folks from the projects, Black folks from the projects. But in so doing, would endow the San Francisco Redevelopment Agency to reclaim their land and make them first in line as a renter. So that the awareness of this devilish dilemma, that support for those who have been denied and neglected was predicated on their own displacement. That awareness of land policy, of the devilish dilemmas that Black folks were being presented with, was also something that was inspiring to me, in the sense that this is not just matters of solidarity, but it's also the complexities of managing solidarity with one's own material well-being, and being asked to choose in ways that white folks in Pack Heights and elsewhere didn't have to choose. And that was the argument being put forward in the Sun Reporter and elsewhere. Yeah, and also, I just think that, like, I think, yeah, I'll stop there, because I could say a whole lot more about the general strike and Du Bois's account and go on, but I'll stop. Thank you, please.
Thank you. I'm Chanel Smith, here at Carnegie Mellon. I just continue to have you have the slide here that talks about segregated schools. That slide, right?
Oh, yeah.
Segregated schools in Mobile, Alabama.
Right.
And I just, as a native Southerner myself, born and raised in Arkansas, we can go into Little Rock 9 and Dave Spade Scholar and all those things. Right? And I think back to, I'm wondering if there's additional tidbits, because you were leaning into strategies and frameworks of Brown versus Board of Education, and historically, and you went a little surface. Additional things as you think about it, because part of the capitalism and the American dream is all invested in the education system. And we see that play out here in Pittsburgh. Closing a school, things of that nature. I'm just wondering, as I look here, and you were setting up a framework just in terms of strategies that were being used during that time, were there additional tidbits that I'm just naturally curious, because when I think about it, we've been talking about things from an urban lens, but I always think about things from a rural lens, because I grew up in rural America. Right. And the school system there, where when I think about these urban places where my family was, basically migrating to Flint and Chicago and Detroit and things of that particular nature, but parts of my family that remained there in those Arkansas spaces, Mississippi and Alabama, it just makes me wonder about what got lost there. And are there some additional things in terms of that access to the American dream, even though we know in these urban settings, they were dealing with similar things as well. But there's these strategies behind, these social strategies behind social movements and Brown versus Board of Education, and then being able to see where the educational system didn't reach what it should have reached, didn't have the far-reaching efforts there. So just wondering naturally additional things that you wanted to hit on there that you did.
Yeah.
This is the one
that
stood out to me so much that I want to go back and do some more reading.
Yeah. No, thank you for the invitation. At the end of the book, I have an extended meditation on these campaigns, and have an article under review. So hopefully that'll be out, and it'll be like the long form example. But I mean, I think you're right. Like gesturing towards one of the things I found incredible. I'll share kind of two examples. One, the first is the Black civil service workers in early 1960s New York City, who are engaged in their own kind of forensic accounting and wondering why they are donating to folks engaged in social struggle in the South to protest segregation while their pensions are being invested in segregated utilities. And recognizing we're pulling money out here and we're, kind of getting it. I mean, basically, folks it's an interesting spatial argument there. And it's also the sense that, we as individuals and even can organize collectively to support the Southern struggle, but who controls our investment decisions around our pension? And so that is an important piece today. When we think about, for instance, where our pensions, where our investments are invested, whether it be in the war-making machinery, whether it be in ecological destruction, the fiscal sensibilities of Black public sector workers in the early 1960s is inspiring to me, because they were, as I said, kind of the vanguard of asking questions around finance capitalism and where funds are invested and where to push on what. And so that is part of the story that I take up. I also think the legal strategies were really fascinating by Core. So the point in the end is actually not to prevent a bond sale per se. It's to tie up a school district and in court to create enough legal uncertainty around that specific bond issue that investors say, well, I can get high tax interest income from another investment that doesn't have such uncertainty surrounding it. And so the legal strategy around turning to the courts, not to win per se, but to make arguments long enough to create enough uncertainty to then compel local officials to desegregate, to accelerate their desegregation program, is a fascinating legal strategy. It's one around drumming up uncertainty, tying up a bond issue. And the theory of change really, and this is one I also find interesting today, is that you can leverage the bond market to check authoritarian structures. I mean, in some sense, of course, it relies on moving and pushing individual investors, holders of capital, to not so much be change agents, but to check other kinds of actors that are not good for their bottom line. That's the theory. That's the theory at work. But they tried to leverage the bond market to check the authoritarian structures remaining in the South. And I think it's an interesting strategy in this moment, as we see the DeSantises and others who would ban basically book banners to ask how their decisions, say, around ESG investing and other kind of attempts to sort of limit what investors can invest in. How can you leverage the bond market to check those actors? Because again, the argument of the book is that structural dependence is a way, it's undemocratic in general, and it's also a way, precisely because it's undemocratic, it can undermine local democratic decisions. Well, can you use the dependence of the bond market to say that the interest rate penalties, the cost of a downgrade, and other costs are sufficient enough to check those who would engage in the kinds of behaviors that are at the very least anti-democratic? And so that's one of the kind of it's a set of strategies, tactics, even though the bond market looks very different from the 1960s, that I find really interesting. It emerges out of the so-called classic liberal phase of the civil rights movement, but in the end, it actually contains a lot of ideas and practices that could be useful in our current moment. I realize I'm probably out of time, but okay, can we get one more question, please?
I actually wondered if you could say a little bit about this whole fraternity.
Sure.
And talk a little bit about the composition of that fraternity and the degree to which its segregated composition became a target of movement among.
Oh, yeah. No, this is a great question. So the chapter in the book is called Fraternity. Anybody who's seen Wolf of Wall Street or any of the kind of one of the things I found in the archives was for lack of a better term, the pornographic depictions of secretaries of these key bankers who projected what it was they wanted to do to their secretaries, who engaged in double entendres. Par value didn't just mean a bond, the amount for a bond. It also was used to make sense of the breast size of their secretaries. And both the kind of joke lore, that joke lore was key to a pedagogy of bond finance, of teaching people what was the bond market and how it worked. So this is the kind of culture of a fraternity, of a mid-20th century fraternity of bond financiers. And it's striking because it's not many people on whom cities rely for their most essential services and infrastructural needs. We're talking about a handful of folks who largely feel like, at least in the case of Brown, who works for Bank of America, he's a voice in the wilderness. Feels like he creates surplus value for the larger institution, allows for dividends to be paid out to stockholders, but is not getting his just due over in the bond department. Is seen as a minor player. But Brown is a part of a fraternity of white male bonding, as I put it in the book. And so that is the kind of you could call it an old boys network. There are many ways to describe it. I describe it as a fraternity, but it's really in the 70s and especially in the 80s, the sense that like where that fraternity becomes a target. And it's part of the whole kind of, as I mentioned, right, post-civil rights story of Black folks demanding other opportunities through, say, city contracts in the corporate boardrooms, who are going to say, we as Black folks need to get in on the deals underwriting a local bond issue. We as Black contractors need to get the contract for various city projects. And so in the 80s, there's a targeting of that culture. And interestingly enough, I've talked to a lot of folks in the finance world who surprisingly actually appreciate the book, you might, but who also, this is really important, like many folks who are attentive to inequality and who entered bond finance in the 80s see that as the moment of a break when the old boys network broke down. And I think what's interesting is old habits die hard. You still see a kind of culture in bond finance that's, patriarchal, where you see racist banter as key to decision-making around investments and underwriting. And so it becomes a target at the same moment in which other industries are targeted for having segregated practices. But in the end, we still have to land on the main point, which is that what does it mean for cities to be dependent on a set of unelected actors, whether you're Black or white, for their most essential services and infrastructural needs? So it's the point about the racial composition is important, representation is important, but it's not a check on, it's not a check on the anti-democratic aspects of the bonding process itself.
So let's give Thank you. Really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure. Pleasure. Thank you all.